I'm Ethan Cole. Senshaba. My family mocked me for inheriting a frozen cabin. But what I found inside changed everything. The rain in Seattle hadn't stopped all morning when I walked into Grant and Associates, the law firm that had handled my family's estate for decades. The air inside smelled like paper and coffee, like every other place where people come to lose or gain everything. I sat at the end of a long polished table, my palms sweating despite the cold. My younger brother Caleb lounged across from me, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my entire car. He was scrolling through his phone, smirking like this was just another business meeting. Edward Grant, our family attorney, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He was the kind of man who never smiled unless someone died or signed a deal. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "your father's will is fairly straightforward." I already knew that meant bad news. Caleb leaned back, fingers tapping the table. "Let's get to it. Ed, I've got a board meeting in an hour." I almost laughed. Of course he did. He was the CEO now. Coltech Innovations, the company my father built from nothing, now fully belonged to him. I used to work there once, buried deep in R&D, until Caleb decided the company needed fresh energy. That was his way of firing me without saying it. Edward unfolded a document and began to read. "To my younger son, Caleb Cole, I leave the controlling interest and assets of Coltech Innovations, along with the primary family residence and financial accounts associated with the company trust." Caleb smiled. I felt the air leave my lungs. Edward continued, his voice steady. "To my elder son, Ethan Cole, I leave the property located in Anchorage, Alaska, known as the Birch Hollow Cabin." That was it. No explanation. No message. Not even a token acknowledgement. Just a cabin in the middle of nowhere. Caleb turned toward me, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Well, brother, guess Dad thought you needed some peace and quiet. Maybe start writing poetry or something." I stared at the table, jaw tight. The attorney's voice faded into the background while my father's words echoed in my head. "Caleb has the leadership. You, Ethan, you just tinker. You'll never understand the bigger picture." When the meeting ended, I stood up too fast and nearly knocked over my chair. Edward reached out, maybe to comfort me, but I stepped back. I couldn't stand another word of polite pity. Caleb walked beside me toward the elevator, hands in his pockets, looking pleased with himself. "You know, Ethan," he said, "Dad was tough on you because he expected more. Guess he finally realized I'm the one who can carry the name forward." "Carry it where?" I asked. "Into bankruptcy court." He laughed. That same arrogant laugh he'd perfected since high school. "Don't be bitter, man. Some people just aren't built for pressure. You're different." I didn't answer. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped in first. For a moment I thought about hitting him. Just once. To feel something other than humiliation. But I didn't. That night, the apartment felt smaller than ever. I stared at the rain streaking down the window, the city lights reflecting off the glass like 1,000 tiny accusations. Rachel was waiting for me on the couch, legs crossed, glass of wine in hand. She looked perfect. As always. Too perfect for the man who just got handed a shack in Alaska. "Well?" she asked, eyes sharp. I dropped the envelope on the table. "Caleb gets the company. I get a cabin." She blinked, like she hadn't heard right. "A what?" "A cabin. In Alaska." Her face twisted. "You're joking. Please tell me you're joking." "I wish I was." She stood up, pacing. "So your brother gets millions, and you get a pile of wood in the snow. What the hell was your father thinking?" I shrugged, trying to sound calm. He probably thought I couldn't handle the company. Rachel scoffed. "Well, he wasn't wrong. Was he? You quit every time things get hard. God. Ethan, you had one chance to prove yourself. That's not fair." She rounded on me, eyes burning. "Fair? You think life's fair? Caleb's out there running a company, living like a king, and you're sitting here in this dump acting like some misunderstood genius." I opened my mouth, But nothing came out. She grabbed her purse. Voice rising. You are pathetic. You always were. I can't do this anymore. She yanked the engagement ring off her finger and threw it onto the table. It bounced once and landed near the envelope with the cabin deed. I'm not wasting my life on a man who's content being a loser. The door slammed so hard the frame rattled. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the ring. Outside, thunder rolled over the city like laughter. Later that night, I poured myself a drink I couldn't taste and unfolded the deed again. Property Birch Hollow Cabin. Anchorage. Alaska. No notes. No explanation. Just coordinates and a signature. I wondered if my father had done this out of spite or pity. Maybe both. When the whiskey ran out, I leaned back and let the silence sink in. For the first time in my life, I had nothing left to lose. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the only way to find out what my father really thought of me was to go there. I looked at the old photo on the shelf. The one with Dad standing between Caleb and me after a company event. Caleb held a trophy. I held a screwdriver. Even then, Dad's hand rested on Caleb's shoulder. Not mine. I folded the photo and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Then, I picked up the deed again. The paper felt heavier now, like it carried more than land or lumber. The next morning, I booked a one-way ticket to Alaska. The plane was small, the kind that rattled every time it hit a gust of wind. Anchorage looked like a postcard from another world, all white and quiet and endless. I stepped out of the terminal into air so cold it burned my lungs. My phone lost signal 5 minutes after the taxi left town. The driver, a guy named Bill with a beard that could hide a bird, dropped me at a gas station on the edge of nowhere. He pointed to an old pickup I had rented online and said good luck, like I was heading into a war. The road north was a sheet of ice bordered by pine trees so tall they looked like walls. For the first hour I kept thinking about Rachel's face when she called me pathetic. The word hit harder in the quiet, echoing in my head every time the tires slid. By the time I saw the faded sign that said Birch Hollow, I was half convinced I was insane for coming here. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow trail, buried under snow. It looked worse than I imagined. Half the roof sagged, the porch tilted, and one of the windows was cracked open like the place had been holding its breath since my father died. I killed the engine and stepped out. The cold sliced through my jeans. A man in a flannel jacket walked toward me from a small snowplow parked nearby. You Ethan, he asked. I nodded. You must be Tom. Yep. Your lawyer called me. Said you might need a hand opening the place up. He handed me a crowbar and pushed the door. The hinges groaned. Inside smelled like dust, rot, and old smoke. The floor creaked under my boots. There was a broken table, a stove rusted to the color of dried blood, and a pile of firewood that looked like it had been stacked decades ago. Hell of an inheritance, Tom muttered. Yeah, I said. Dad really knew how to pick his favorites. He gave me a look, the kind you give a man standing at his own funeral, then clapped me on the shoulder. There's a hardware store 20 miles back. You'll need nails, tarp, and patience. When he left, the silence pressed in. I started moving, clearing out debris, sweeping dust. My breath fogged in front of me. The more I cleaned, the more the place felt like a bad joke. Who leaves their son a collapsing cabin while handing the other a tech empire? By nightfall I had patched one window with duct tape, found a lantern that still worked, and a mattress that didn't. I lit a small fire, poured the last of my coffee into a tin mug, and stared at the flames. It was quiet in a way that city noise never is. The kind of quiet that makes you hear everything you try to forget. I thought about my father sitting in his office. Sharp suit, calm voice. How he once told me leadership wasn't about ideas but control. Caleb had that in spades. I never wanted control. I wanted to build things. Machines didn't judge you. People did. Around midnight the fire died down. I got up to throw more wood on it and my boot hit something hollow under the rug. I stopped. The sound was different. Not just wood against wood. I knelt and knocked again. Hollow. My stomach tightened. I pulled the rug aside. Beneath it was a patch of floor that looked newer than the rest. Smoother. As if someone had replaced it recently. I ran my hand over the boards and felt a faint ridge. It wasn't random. It was a seam. I found a hammer in a drawer and pried at the edge. The plank lifted an inch. Enough for me to see metal underneath. A square of rusted steel with a handle welded to it. "What the hell?" I whispered. I tried to lift it, but it was heavy. I used the crowbar Tom left behind. The seal cracked. A sound like breath after years underwater. Cold air rose up from the opening, carrying the smell of dirt and something else. Like oil. I shined my flashlight inside. The beam hit a metal lid. Rectangular. Maybe a safe. My heart started pounding. I sat back, breath clouding the air. It could have been anything. Tools. Money. Maybe nothing at all. But my father didn't do anything without reason. If he'd hidden something here, it wasn't a coincidence. I dropped the plank back in place and covered it with the rug. Not tonight. I was too tired, too cold, and too wired to deal with secrets. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the cracks in the walls. Pale and sharp, I poured instant coffee into a mug and walked outside. The forest was still. No cars. No hum of life. Just the crunch of my boots and the wind moving through the trees. Tom came back around noon with supplies in his truck. "Looks like you found work cut out for you," he said. "Yeah, the place is a wreck." He helped me patch the roof and replace a few planks. While we worked, he asked about my father. I told him the basics. Founder of Coal Tech. Built a company from his garage. Genius. Ruthless. Tom whistled. "So your brother runs it now?" "Huh. Runs it into the ground, maybe." "You sound like you got history." I smiled without humor. We all got history. After he left, I stood in the middle of the room. Hammer still in my hand. The repaired boards looked cleaner now. But all I could think about was what lay beneath the one I hadn't touched. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt my father's shadow in the room. Heavy and deliberate. Maybe the cabin wasn't a punishment. Maybe it was a test. By night, the fire burned steady. I poured myself another mug of coffee and sat on the floor near that rug. My father's voice echoed again. Not the cold corporate tone, but the rare one I'd heard when I was a kid. "Someday, Ethan, you'll understand why I make the choices I do." I took a deep breath, the kind that hurts on the way out. The floor beneath me creaked softly, like it was waiting. Tomorrow. I told myself, tomorrow I open it. The snow outside began to fall harder, tapping against the glass like a clock counting down. The storm passed overnight, leaving the world quiet and silver. I woke up before dawn, sitting for a while just listening to the wind scrape against the walls. The thought of what was under that floorboard had kept me awake most of the night. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe some old tools or a storage hatch. But my father never hid anything for no reason. I made a pot of coffee on the small propane burner I found in a cabinet, grabbed the crowbar, and pushed the rug aside. The cold air hit me like a warning when I pried the plank up again. The steel handle was frozen stiff. It took 2 hard pulls before the seal broke, and a smell like earth and oil rolled out. My flashlight beam caught on something rectangular, coated in dust. A safe. I crouched down, brushed the surface with my glove. There was a faded logo from a manufacturer I hadn't seen in years. My father must have installed it decades ago. The lock had a simple combination dial. I turned it slowly, listening for the clicks. He used the same style on his lab safes at Coltech, and I used to help him with them when I was a kid. The memory hit me hard, him standing behind me, guiding my hand. Listen for the soft click. "Ethan, patience is precision." My fingers trembled a little as I spun the dial. I tried his birthday first. Nothing. Then my mother's. Still nothing. Finally, I tried the year Coltech was founded. Ichenjobai Joshaba. The mechanism gave a dull click. I exhaled slowly and pulled the handle. The door opened with a sound like tearing fabric. Inside was a stack of folders, sealed in plastic. A metal box. And a brown envelope marked in my father's handwriting, for Ethan only. My throat tightened. I took everything out and laid it on the table. The folders were labeled Project Helios. Volume 1 through 3. The name stirred something faintly familiar. I opened the first folder. Technical schematics. Energy grids. Neural models for adaptive algorithms. It looked like an early hybrid between AI and renewable energy systems. I opened the metal box next. Inside was a portable hard drive and a notarized document. I unfolded it carefully. Transfer of intellectual property. Rights from Richard Cole to Ethan Cole. Signed and sealed, July 2018. The notary stamp was real, complete with signature and registration number. For a minute, I couldn't move. My father had transferred the rights to a full-scale technology project to me 5 years before his death. A project Coltech had just announced as their newest innovation. I remembered the news article Caleb posted 2 months ago, bragging about their upcoming Helios launch. He'd stolen it. I opened the envelope last. There was a handwritten letter. The paper slightly yellowed. The ink still sharp. Ethan, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. What I have left here is not a gift or a test. It is trust. You have always built quietly, without ego. That is why I'm giving you the one thing I cannot leave to your brother. Caleb is bold, but reckless. He chases glory. You understand patience, and you value creation over applause. Protect this. Do not sell it. And do not let pride destroy what I've spent my life building. In time, you'll understand. Love. Dad. I read it 3 times before I realized I was shaking. The weight of every year I'd spent trying to prove myself hit me all at once. All those dinners where Dad ignored my stories. The promotions he handed to Caleb. The lectures about ambition. Maybe he hadn't seen me as weak. Maybe he'd been preparing me. I sat there for a long time, staring at the papers. The fire in the stove had gone out, but I didn't feel cold anymore. There was too much running through me. Shock. Anger. Disbelief. Something that might have been pride but felt more like grief. By afternoon I'd spread everything across the table. The technical data alone could fill a warehouse. I plugged the hard drive into my laptop, half expecting it to be empty. But the folders opened immediately. Dozens of prototypes. Notes. Test videos. My father's voice filled the room from one of the recordings. Helios isn't just an energy model. It's a self-learning network. Whoever controls this can reshape how the world uses power. I froze. The timestamp was 2019, long after Caleb had taken over day-to-day operations. He'd told everyone Helios was his concept. He'd lied. That evening, I emailed a copy of the notarized document to myself and stored the hard drive in my backpack. I didn't know who to trust. But I knew one thing. This wasn't staying here. When I stepped outside, the snow had stopped, and the forest looked endless. The cabin behind me felt different now. Not like a punishment, but like a vault. My father hadn't rejected me. He'd chosen me. As the sky dimmed, I thought of Caleb again, standing in that boardroom, all confidence and charm. He'd think this was a joke. He always did. I pictured his face when he realized I held the real Helios project. I went back inside and sat by the window. The letter from Dad lay open on the table, edges curling near the firelight. I thought of what it meant to protect something like this. It wasn't just money. It was power. And danger. For a moment I considered calling Caleb, asking him directly if he knew. But I stopped. He'd deny it. Twist it. Make me doubt what I'd found. He always did. Instead, I grabbed my notebook and started writing everything down. Dates. Names. The contents of every folder. It was what my father would have done. At some point the night slipped in completely, wrapping the cabin in silence. I could almost hear my father's voice again. Calm and deliberate. Patience. Ethan. Precision. The safe sat open in the floor, like a wound finally exposed to air. I closed it gently, set the rug back in place, and looked around the cabin one last time before turning off the light. Tomorrow I'd fly back to Seattle. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to start. The first thing I noticed when I landed back in Seattle was how loud everything felt. Cars. People. Phone alerts. The hum of the airport. After a week in Alaska, it all sounded like static. I carried the backpack with the hard drive and documents like it was a bomb no one else knew about. I didn't go home. I went straight to Edward Grant's office. He looked surprised when I walked in, covered in travel grime, eyes bloodshot. Ethan. Good Lord. Where have you been? Alaska. I said. I found something. When I dropped the hard drive and the envelope on his desk, his eyebrows lifted. He read the first page of the notarized document. Then again slower, his lips moving silently over each word. Your father transferred intellectual property to you in 2018. This is legal, properly executed. But what exactly is Helios? His last project, I said. And the same one Coltech just announced as their flagship product. Edward leaned back in his chair, tapping the edge of the document. If what you're saying is true, Caleb is sitting on a stolen patent. You need a specialist. I can connect you to someone who deals with intellectual property cases. Do it, I said. That was how I met Samantha Lee. Her office was downtown, lined with books and framed certificates. She had the look of someone who'd seen too many lawsuits and lost none of them. She glanced at the folder and the USB drive. You're sure this is your father's original work? Positive. I helped him prototype the base algorithm years ago. Caleb didn't even know it existed until after Dad's stroke. She plugged the drive in and skimmed a few files. Neural adaptive grid management, she murmured. Self-learning power systems. This could revolutionize clean energy. She turned to me. Do you understand how valuable this is? I nodded. My father said to protect it. That's what I'm trying to do. She leaned forward, eyes sharp. Then listen carefully. If Coltech incorporated this technology without permission, they're in violation of federal intellectual property law. You own the IP. That means you can file a temporary restraining order to freeze their launch and demand a full audit. My stomach tightened. That would destroy the company. Or reveal the truth, she said. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by documents. I kept rereading my father's letter until the words blurred. Protect this. Do not sell it. Do not let pride destroy what I've spent my life building. For the first time, those words didn't sound like advice. They sounded like a warning. The next morning, an email popped up from an unknown address. The subject line was just Helios. I opened it. I worked with your father. He trusted me. We need to talk. Do not forward this. There was a name at the bottom, Howard Lane. I called Samantha and told her about it. She frowned but said, if he's legitimate, he could help. But meet him in a public place. Record everything. We agreed to meet that evening at a diner near Lake Union. It was raining again. Because it's always raining in this city. I sat in a corner booth, the envelope of documents under my jacket. Howard showed up exactly on time. Tall and gray-haired, wearing an old windbreaker with the Coltech logo on it. He slid into the seat across from me without shaking hands. His eyes were tired but steady. Your father was a brilliant man, he said softly. Too brilliant for his own good. He trusted the wrong people. You worked with him on Helios. He nodded. From the beginning, when Caleb started sniffing around after your dad's first stroke, I knew it was trouble. He wanted to move the project under corporate control. But your father refused, said it wasn't ready. And he didn't trust the board. Then suddenly your dad was gone. And 2 months later, Coltech announced they had a new flagship technology. Same name. Same framework. I saw the files. They were your father's. I warned Caleb it was a bad idea. He told me to keep my mouth shut if I wanted my pension. I felt something in my chest twist. Why come to me now? Because he's about to launch Helios 2.0 globally. And if that happens, your father's work is gone forever. Once it hits production, you'll never prove it was stolen. He slid a small flash drive across the table. This has internal memos and version logs. They prove your father's original code was copied line by line. Why help me, I asked. He smiled sadly. Because I watched your father die worrying about you. He said you were the only one who still built things for the right reason. I didn't know what to say. I took the drive and shook his hand. His grip was cold but firm. Back in my car, I stared at the city lights reflecting on the wet glass. For years I thought I was the failure. But now, with that little flash drive in my pocket, I felt something shift. I wasn't the background anymore. I had proof. That night Caleb called me. I hadn't spoken to him since the will reading. His voice was casual. Smooth as always. Hey big brother. Long time. Heard you took a little trip up north. How did you hear about that? I have my ways, he said. I also hear you found something interesting out there. Maybe some old files Dad forgot to mention. I said nothing. Listen. Ethan, you've never been good with business. If you came across something, anything, it's safer with me. I can make it worth your while. What are you offering? He laughed softly. Let's not pretend this is about money. You wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. Just hand it over. Family first. Right. I gripped the phone so tight my knuckles ached. You stole from Dad. You used his work. His tone hardened. Careful with your words. You're out of your depth. Ethan, if you go poking around, you'll regret it. The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, staring at the dark screen. Then I looked at my father's handwriting again. That one word that stood out more than any other. Trust. Maybe that's why he left it to me. Not Caleb. Because he knew Caleb would sell it. Twist it. Ruin it. Because he knew I wouldn't. I poured a drink and sat by the window. The rain blurred the city outside into streaks of gray. I didn't know exactly what to do next. But I knew I couldn't back down now. For the first time in years, I felt something close to purpose. And under it, a slow burn of anger that had been waiting my whole life to surface. Tomorrow, I told myself, I start fighting back. Morning came gray and heavy. The kind of Seattle morning that made it hard to tell if the sun had even bothered to rise. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Caleb's face. That smug grin. The way he spoke like he already owned me. The flash drive from Howard sat next to my laptop, waiting like a loaded gun. I called Samantha first thing. She answered before the second ring. Did you get what you needed? Yeah. I think I have proof. Internal files. Version logs. Everything. Bring it to my office, she said. By the time I got there, the rain had turned into a steady sheet against her windows. I handed her the drive and watched as she plugged it in. The files loaded one after another, each stamped with Coltech's digital signature, each matching perfectly with my father's blueprints. She scrolled through in silence, her jaw tightening. Who gave you this? She asked. Howard Lane. He worked with my dad. She nodded slowly. I know that name. He left Coltech a few years back. This is solid evidence. Ethan. Enough to request an injunction and file a TRO before they release Helios 2. Lean. What happens if we win? If the court accepts the claim, Coltech's product launch is frozen. No solace. No marketing. No investors. It would put them on ice until the full case is settled. I leaned back in the chair. That would kill the company. She looked at me hard. You don't seem sure if that's what you want. I didn't answer right away. I thought about Caleb. About how easily he'd taken everything. How he'd smiled at Dad's funeral like it was a press conference. No. I said finally. I'm sure. We spent hours building the case. Samantha outlined the process. Drafted affidavits. Prepared documentation for the federal court. She moved with calm precision. The kind of person who found power in control. I watched her and thought of my father's voice again. Patience is precision. By late afternoon, she printed out the final page for my signature. Once you sign this, there's no going back, she said. I signed. My name looked strange next to my father's, like it didn't belong there yet. I was halfway out the door when a man in a charcoal suit walked in. Mid-50s. Slick hair. Confident stride. He smiled without warmth. Ethan Cole. Yes. He extended a card. Mark Hanley. CFO at Coltech. Mind if I have a word? Samantha stepped forward. Instantly on guard. This isn't the place for that. Mr. Hanley. He waved her off politely. Relax. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just a conversation between professionals. He gestured toward the hallway. Against my better judgment, I followed. He leaned against the wall, adjusting his cufflinks. Look. I'll get straight to it. We know you've been digging. And frankly, this little stunt with the lawyer, not a good look. You could hurt a lot of people. I'm just trying to protect what's mine, I said. He chuckled. You really think that paperwork means anything? Come on. You've been out of the game for years. Your dad might have signed something, but corporate ownership is complicated. The board will bury you in litigation before you ever see a dime." "Then why are you here?" I asked. His smile tightened. "Because I'm offering you a way out. You sell us the rights to Helios. Whatever imaginary claim you think you have. For $1,000, we sign a mutual non-disclosure. Everyone walks away clean." I stared at him. 1,000. That's generous, considering we don't need to give you anything. For a moment, I just looked at him. His arrogance was the same as Caleb's. Maybe even worse. I thought about the years I'd spent watching them make decisions over my head, treating me like a nuisance. "You really think I'd sell my father's legacy for $1,000? He shrugged. "I think you'll come to your senses once the bills start piling up. You don't have the money for this kind of fight. Ethan, Coltech has a full legal team and friends in every corner of this city." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "You might have lawyers. I have the truth. Let's see who runs out of oxygen first." His smile faltered just a little before he turned to leave. "Suit yourself. But don't say you weren't warned." When he was gone, I went back into Samantha's office. She raised an eyebrow. "He tried to buy you off. Didn't he?" "Yeah. For $1,000. She let out a small, humorless laugh. Classic intimidation move. Don't bite. They're scared. Which means we're ahead. That night, I drove home through the rain, my mind racing. Every red light felt like it took hours. When I got home, I poured a drink and stood by the window again, watching headlights blur through the glass. I thought about what Mark said. About money. Lawyers. Power. He wasn't wrong about one thing. I didn't have their resources. But I had something they didn't expect. Proof. I went over the plan again in my head. The TRO filing would hit the court docket in the morning. Once approved, Coltech wouldn't be able to move forward without answering the claim. I imagined Caleb's face when he found out. For the first time in years, the idea of him losing something made me feel lighter. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a new email. It was from Samantha. The subject read, "Filing complete." She had done it. The case was now public record. I exhaled slowly and set the phone down. The fight had officially begun. Before going to bed, I pulled out my father's letter again. I read it by the dim light over the counter. His handwriting steady and deliberate. "You understand patience. You value creation over applause. Protect this." I traced the last line with my thumb, then folded it carefully and slid it back into my wallet. I didn't know how this would end. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. Outside, the city lights reflected off the wet pavement. The world moving like nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. Tomorrow, Coltech would wake up to the news that someone had just frozen their golden project. And that someone was me. The phone started ringing before sunrise. By the third call, I knew it was Caleb. I didn't answer. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee. The morning paper opened to the business section. Coltech Innovations product launch, halted by court order. The headline was big enough to make me laugh. Even though my hands were shaking, the TRO had gone through faster than I expected. By 8, Samantha called. Her voice was calm but tight. "They're furious. Ethan." Their legal team filed an emergency motion to dismiss. But the judge denied it. "You just bought us time." "How much time?" "A week. Maybe 2. Long enough for the story to spread." I could hear the weight in her tone. A week in corporate time was an eternity. Stocks could collapse in a day. "Stay quiet," she said. "Don't answer anything from the press or from Coltech. Let them twist for a bit." "I can do that." But Caleb didn't take silence well. By noon, he sent a text. "You really think this will end well for you?" Followed by another. "You're playing with fire. Big brother." I put the phone face down and turned off notifications. My apartment felt smaller than ever. Every creak in the walls sounding like tension. That afternoon, Samantha and I met with her research team in a small downtown office. She introduced me to a woman named Laura, a forensic analyst who specialized in IP verification. She looked through the files and nodded. "It's solid. Their code matches your father's original by 97%. That's a smoking gun." Samantha smiled for the first time that day. "Then we hold our ground." Still, I couldn't relax. Power like this didn't go down quietly. 2 days later, while I was grabbing lunch near my place, I noticed a black car idling by the curb, same one that had been behind me the day before. I walked faster, turned down a side street, then doubled back. The car was gone. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe not. That night, my phone rang again. This time, I picked up. Caleb's voice came through, sharp and angry. You think you can humiliate me? You just cost my company millions. You think investors are going to believe some washed-up coder over me? I don't have to make them believe me. I just have to show them proof. He laughed bitterly. You don't understand what you've started. You're not built for this. Ethan, you've never been built for this. I let the silence stretch until I could hear him breathing. Maybe not, but I am built to finish it. Then I hung up. By the weekend, Coltech's shares dropped 28%. News outlets were calling it the Helios controversy. Analysts debated on morning shows whether Caleb could survive as CEO. Samantha kept me updated hourly. We've rattled them, she said. Their board called an emergency meeting. That usually means heads will roll. Monday morning, a courier arrived at my door with a thick envelope. Inside was an official offer from Coltech's lawyers. Settlement proposal. $1,000 in exchange for full rights to Project Helios and a signed non-disclosure agreement. I almost laughed. They hadn't even tried to hide the insult. I called Samantha. They're still playing games. Let me guess. The $1,000 offer. Yeah. She sighed. That's intimidation wrapped as negotiation. Don't respond. Every move they make tells the judge they're scared. I folded the letter and threw it in the trash. I want them to see what scared looks like. 2 days later, the first hearing was scheduled. Federal Court. San Francisco. Samantha flew down early. I followed that evening. The flight quiet, except for the hum of the engine. Somewhere over Oregon. I pulled the letter from my wallet and read my father's words again. Protect this. Do not let pride destroy it. I wondered if this was what he meant. The courthouse was smaller than I imagined. Old and pale stone against the fog. Inside, everything smelled of paper and nerves. Coltech's legal team filled one side of the courtroom. Sharp suits and expensive watches. Caleb sat at the end of the row. Jaw tight. Eyes locked on me when I walked in. He looked older than I remembered. Tired. But still radiating arrogance. Samantha leaned toward me. Don't look at him. Look at the judge. The hearing started. Coltech's attorney argued first, painting me as a disgruntled son, claiming I was trying to extort money from a family business. When it was Samantha's turn, her voice didn't shake once. She laid out the timeline. The notarized transfer, the hard drive logs, and finally the forensic report. This is not a family feud, she said. This is a case of corporate theft, disguised as inheritance, misdirection. The judge listened, quiet and expressionless. When Samantha finished, she handed over the evidence packet. The opposing counsel tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. Enough. I'll review. Then, to my surprise, a woman from the gallery stood up. She introduced herself as Laura Nunez, a field investigator for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. She'd been monitoring the case. Your Honor, she said. We've independently verified that the Helios blueprint, filed by Coltech, matches a 2018 prototype registered under Richard Cole's name, later transferred to Ethan Cole. The duplication rate is conclusive. A low murmur spread through the room. Caleb's lawyer asked for a recess, but the judge denied it. He looked at me, then at Samantha. Temporary restraining order remains in effect. Coltech is to cease all activity related to Helios, pending further review. The gavel hit once, sharp and final. Outside, reporters waited, microphones flashing. Samantha pushed through them. No comments, she said. I followed her out to the steps. My heart was still hammering, but the air felt different, lighter. Caleb came out behind us, his face pale, his tie loosened. He caught up to me on the sidewalk, his voice low. You think this is over? You just killed the company. Our father's company. I turned to him. No. You did that when you stole from him. For a moment, he looked like he might hit me. Then he just smiled, that cold smile I'd seen my whole life. "You've got no idea what you've started." I watched him walk away, swallowed by the crowd and cameras. That night, alone in the hotel room, I stared at the city lights through the window. My hands were still trembling, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was adrenaline. On my phone, a news alert flashed. Coltech stock down 40%. Analysts warn of potential collapse. I poured a glass of water and sat down on the edge of the bed. For the first time, the word that had haunted me since childhood didn't sting anymore. Failure. Maybe that was what it took to finally win. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain against the window. Steady and calm. The storm had only just begun. By the time I flew back to Seattle, the story was everywhere. Every news feed. Every business headline. Every morning show had my name somewhere in the middle of a sentence about Coltech's downfall. Helios patent controversy. Coltech, under federal investigation. Former CEO accused of intellectual property fraud. I didn't have to say a word. The world was already talking for me. Samantha had told me to lay low. And I did. I stayed in my apartment. Blinds half closed. The TV muted, but the ticker still scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Coltech stock had dropped another 15% in a single day. There were rumors that their board was preparing to remove Caleb as CEO. It should have made me feel good. It did. For a minute. Then it just felt heavy. My phone buzzed nonstop. Calls from unknown numbers. Reporters. Lawyers. Even distant relatives who had ignored me for years suddenly wanted to hear my side. I ignored them all. I didn't want anyone's attention. I just wanted peace. And maybe the truth about who my father really thought I was. That peace didn't last long. On the third night, someone buzzed my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and froze. Rachel. She was standing there in a long coat. Hair, perfect. Smile rehearsed. For a second I almost didn't open the door. But curiosity won. "Ethan," she said softly, like she'd been practicing my name. "Rachel. You look good." I leaned against the frame. "You didn't come here to compliment me." She laughed lightly. The same laugh that used to sound like music, but now just felt hollow. "I heard what's happening. It's all over the news. You're finally getting the recognition you deserve." "Is that what you think this is? Recognition?" She hesitated, eyes flicking past me into the apartment. "Can I come in?" "No." The word hung between us like a wall. Her smile faltered. "Ethan. Look. I made a mistake. I was angry. Scared. When your father's will came out, I thought you'd lost everything. I didn't know." "You didn't know I'd be worth something." I said. "That's not fair. It's the only thing that's ever been fair." She took a small step forward, her voice soft. "I just want a chance to talk. To fix things." I almost laughed. "Fix what? The part where you called me a loser, or the part where you threw our future on the table?" Her expression hardened for a split second before she caught herself. I miss you." I studied her for a long moment. The woman I had once loved wasn't standing there anymore. This version was driven by fear. Not affection. Fear of being left behind. Fear of losing her connection to something valuable. "I don't miss you," I said quietly. Then I closed the door. Her knock echoed once. Twice. Then stopped. The sound faded into silence. I stood there, hand still on the handle, and felt something shift inside me. Not triumph. Not even satisfaction. Just release. She was part of the old version of me. The man who begged for approval, who waited for someone else to tell him he mattered. That man was gone. The next morning, the financial news confirmed what Samantha had predicted. The SEC had officially opened an investigation into Coltech's leadership for patent fraud. Reporters gathered outside the company headquarters as board members slipped in and out of the glass doors like ghosts. By noon, it was confirmed. Caleb Cole had been removed as CEO. Samantha called a few hours later. "It's over." The board voted him out unanimously. "They're filing for Chapter 11 protection." "You won, Ethan." I didn't answer right away. The words didn't sound real. "You did the right thing," she said more gently. Your father would have been proud. After the call, I walked to the park near my apartment. It was quiet, except for the wind and the sound of geese overhead. The sun was low, turning the water gold. I sat on a bench and just breathed. For the first time in a long time, the air didn't taste bitter. That evening, I turned on the news again. There was Caleb, walking out of the Coltech building surrounded by cameras. His face looked pale, drawn. No trace of the confident CEO who used to own every room. A reporter shouted a question about the lawsuit. He didn't answer. He just kept walking. The next segment mentioned me by name. Ethan Cole, the elder son of Coltech founder Richard Cole, holds legal ownership of the Helios technology that was allegedly misused. Sources close to the investigation suggest the company could face hundreds of millions in losses. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark. Somewhere deep down, I felt a flicker of pity for Caleb. He'd spent his whole life chasing power, and now it was gone. A few days later, Samantha invited me to her office for an update. She had that look she got when she was trying to balance victory with professionalism. The case is moving fast. With the TRO and the investigation, Coltech's assets are frozen. Investors are already pulling out. You'll start getting offers soon. Offers for the patent, licensing, partnerships. People will want to work with you now. I shook my head. Not yet. She smiled. You sound like your father. As I left her office, my phone buzzed again. A number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. But something made me answer. Ethan Cole, a man's voice said, Yes. My name's Alan Burke. I represent a group of clean energy investors. We've been following the case. I'd like to meet and talk about the future of Helios. No pressure. Just a conversation. I paused. I'm not selling anything. I'm not asking you to. I just think the right person should carry your father's work forward. Maybe that person is you. He gave me a time and a place. Then hung up. That night I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about my father again. How he had chosen me. Not because I was loud or ambitious, but because I understood restraint. Maybe that was what leadership really meant. Knowing when to fight and when to protect. When morning came, I drove out of the city. The highway was empty. The sky pale and clean. I didn't know where I was going until I was already halfway there. Alaska. The cabin. The place where it all started. I needed to see it again. Not as the son who had been left behind, but as the man who had finally understood why. The closer I got to Alaska, the quieter the world became. The hum of city noise faded behind me, replaced by the low growl of the plane and the endless white of the clouds below. When we landed, the air was sharp and clean, cutting through my lungs like it was purging everything old. I rented a truck from a small airstrip outside Anchorage and started driving north. The roads were empty except for the occasional logging truck barreling the other way. It took 6 hours to reach the edge of the property. The same forest. The same frozen river. The same silence I remembered. The cabin stood where I'd left it. Still patched from my last repairs, but holding strong against the cold. The snow had piled up high around the porch. I turned off the engine and just sat there, looking at it. Last time I was here, I was broken. Now I was something else. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and old wood. I built a fire and watched it catch, the orange glow pushing back the shadows. Then I lifted the rug and pulled open the trapdoor. The hinges creaked like they were greeting me. I climbed down into the cellar, flashlight in hand, and felt the air grow colder. The crates were still there, untouched. The gold, the jewelry, the ledgers, my parents' secret, my inheritance. I sat on the same crate I had before and opened the ledger again. The handwriting was still steady and neat. My father's notes running alongside my mother's careful annotations. But this time, I noticed something new. A folded map tucked between 2 pages, marked with coordinates I hadn't seen before. I flattened it under the beam of my flashlight. The handwriting beside the red X said, Future Site. Liantianling Ishaba. I traced the lines with my finger. It wasn't far from the cabin, maybe a mile east through the woods. I packed a flashlight, a small shovel, and my father's old compass. The snow was thick, the air still. Every crunch under my boots echoed like thunder. I followed the compass through the trees until I found a rise in the ground. Half buried under snowdrift, I started digging. After about 20 minutes, the shovel hit metal. I cleared the snow and saw the edge of a steel container. My breath fogged the air as I scraped away more snow, until I found a latch sealed tight with rust. I pried it open. Inside were 3 sealed tubes, each labeled Helios V2, core design. My father hadn't just built one version. He'd built a successor. I stared at the markings until my hands started to shake. These weren't backups. They were improvements. My father had been working on a cleaner, faster, safer iteration of the Helios project. The one Coltech stole wasn't even the final version. This was. I carried one of the tubes back to the cabin, careful not to drop it. The fire was still burning when I set it down on the table. I unsealed the cap, and inside was a thick roll of schematics, hand-drawn in pencil, dated just a few months before my father's death. Each page detailed a new integration model for grid-level clean energy, one that could power entire cities without waste. I sat there for hours reading through it, until my eyes burned from the light. The full picture finally started to form. My father hadn't just trusted me with wealth. He'd trusted me with the next phase of his life's work. Caleb had stolen the incomplete version and ruined it. I had the real one sitting in front of me. As the fire dimmed, I leaned back in the chair and thought about what to do next. The right move wasn't revenge anymore. It was legacy. If I used this the way my father intended, I could build something lasting, something clean, something that wasn't just a middle finger to my brother but a gift to the future. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. I stepped out onto the porch. The sky was clear, stars stretching endlessly across the dark. It was so quiet I could hear my own breath. I remembered sitting here before, feeling like the world had abandoned me. Now I felt something entirely different. When I went back inside, I noticed something on the table I hadn't seen before. A small metal box, covered in dust. I must have overlooked it last time. I opened it and found a flash drive inside, labeled Richard Cole. Message. My pulse quickened. I found my laptop, plugged it in, and waited. The screen flickered, and then his voice filled the room. Rough, tired, but familiar. If you're hearing this, it means you found what I left for you. I wish I could explain everything in person, but time wasn't on my side. Caleb has ambition. But you, Ethan, you have patience. And that's what the world needs now more than power. He paused, the faint sound of paper rustling in the background. Helios was never meant to be about profit. It was meant to free people. If it ends up in the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon. That's why I hid the real version. If you choose to finish what I started, do it your way. Build it right. Not for headlines. For people. The audio ended there, replaced by silence. I sat staring at the screen long after it went black. For years I'd been searching for validation, for proof that I mattered to him. And now I had it. Not in money or inheritance, but in trust. He hadn't chosen me because I was stronger. He'd chosen me because I could carry the burden without turning it into greed. I slept on the floor beside the fire that night, the old logs crackling as snow drifted outside. In my dreams, I saw my father standing at the edge of the forest, looking at me with that same quiet pride he'd never spoken aloud. When morning came, the world was white and still. I brewed coffee on the old stove, packed the Helios V2 designs into a waterproof case, and looked around the cabin one last time. This place had broken me and built me all over again. It wasn't a curse. It was a forge. I locked the door, stepped out into the snow, and looked toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, in all that empty land, was the future my father had envisioned. And now, it was mine to protect. I started walking. The wind was cold, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel it. The wind howled behind me as I walked away from the cabin, each step sinking into fresh snow that stretched out like an untouched canvas. I could feel the weight of the Helios V2 case in my backpack, heavier than gold, heavier than anything I had ever carried. The road ahead was uncertain, but for once, it didn't scare me. The fear was gone. replaced by something steady and quiet. Purpose. When I reached Anchorage 2 days later, I called Samantha. She sounded relieved to hear my voice. "You disappeared," she said. "I needed time," I told her. "And I found something." I met her at her office that afternoon. She poured coffee for both of us as I placed the case on the table and opened it. Her eyes widened when she saw the schematics. "Is this what I think it is?" "Helios version 2. I said. "The real one. My father's final design." She traced the pages with her fingers like they were sacred. "Ethan, this could change everything. Do you have any idea what you're holding?" "Yeah," I said softly. "Responsibility." For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she looked up. "What do you want to do with it?" That question stayed with me long after I left her office. I drove back to Seattle the next morning, taking the long route through the mountains. Somewhere along the way, I realized I didn't want to sell it. I didn't want to turn it into another corporate trophy. My father didn't build Helios for money. He built it because he believed the world needed a way to do better. When I got home, my inbox was overflowing. Offers, interviews, investors, journalists. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. I ignored them all except one email. It was from Alan Burke, the man who had called before I left. He had written just 5 words. "Let's build this right. Together." I met him at a small cafe near the harbor. He was older, calm. The kind of man who didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. He told me he ran a private fund focused on clean energy startups. "We don't do corporate takeovers," he said. "We help build legacies." I listened carefully, trying to read between the lines. "And what do you want from me?" "Just the chance to help you finish what your father started." It sounded too simple. But when he handed me the partnership documents, there were no tricks. I took them home and read every line. It wasn't about ownership. It was about stewardship. Control stayed with me. That was what made me say yes. Months passed, and the work began. We built a small team. Engineers and programmers who believed in what Helios stood for. We didn't work in a skyscraper or some glossy office downtown. We rented an old warehouse by the docks, converted it into a lab, and started bringing my father's vision to life. Every morning I'd walk in, smell the coffee and solder and metal, and feel something I hadn't felt in years. Belonging. Samantha joined as legal counsel, keeping the wolves away. Alan handled investors who tried to circle back once they realized we weren't for sale. And me. I kept my head down, writing code, testing circuits, debugging the new core algorithm. Every time it worked, even for a second, it felt like my father was in the room watching. Then one morning, the power flickered on in our first Helios prototype. The readings stabilized, the grid held, and the monitor lit up with a single word: active. No applause, no cheering, just silence. Thick and full of meaning, I stood there staring at the screen, my throat tight. All the anger, the humiliation, the years of being dismissed, they didn't matter anymore. This was what mattered. The light stayed on. A week later, the news broke that Coltech had officially filed for bankruptcy. Caleb's face was on every business page. His assets frozen. His name dragged through hearings. I didn't feel joy when I read it. Just closure. The storm had burned itself out. One night, I went back to my father's letter again. The edges were worn. The ink slightly faded. But the words still hit the same. "We knew you would protect this legacy, not squander it." I closed my eyes and whispered, "I did it, Dad. I protected it." Life didn't turn into a fairy tale after that. There were still late nights, broken prototypes, financial scares, and endless meetings. But there was also progress. We tested the first live Helios grid outside Fairbanks, powering a small township entirely on renewable energy for 90 days straight. It worked better than anyone predicted. Reporters came calling again. And this time, I didn't hide. I told them the truth, that it wasn't about revenge or winning or proving anyone wrong. It was about doing the right thing when no one believed you could. One evening, after another long day at the lab, I walked down to the pier near the water. The city lights shimmered across the bay. And for a moment, I thought about everything that had happened. My father's voice. Caleb's arrogance. Rachel's betrayal. The cabin. The gold. The darkness. The climb back up. It all led here. To this moment of stillness. I took my phone out and opened a blank recording. If you're listening to this, I said quietly, then maybe you're standing where I once stood. Maybe you've been told you're not enough, that you'll never amount to anything, that someone else is destined to be the success story. Don't believe it. Sometimes the world gives you the broken cabin so you can learn to build something better inside it. Sometimes what feels like rejection is really trust. I stopped recording and smiled. A tired but honest smile. Then I walked back toward the lights. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that the greatest revenge isn't destroying someone else's life. It's rebuilding your own so strong that no one can break it again. My father didn't leave me a fortune. He left me a chance to become the man he always believed I could be. So, if my story made you think, if you've ever been the one left behind and wondered if there's more waiting for you on the other side of failure, stay a while. Because stories like mine don't end when the lights go out. They start when you find the courage to turn them back on.